What's wrong with you people? Oh gosh, well it's just absolutely wonderful to see you all tonight.
In spite of this nasty weather.
In spite of the nasty weather, Tony. That's for sure. Anyway, welcome tonight. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, the host for our program tonight. We're the Indiana voice for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter in the Middle East. And we take that responsibility very seriously. We're in our, since 2019, we're in our 15th year of doing this. And from the very beginning, really from the very start, Plymouth Church has been just such an integral part of who we are. And we're really grateful to the pastors and the leadership and the people of Plymouth Church for their partnership in our work. And so I want to invite Pastor Timothy Murphy to say a word of welcome to us tonight, who's the pastor and teacher here at Plymouth Congregational Church, United Church of Christ.
Good evening again. Thank you all for being able to come out tonight. Just a few logistical things to let you know about. Thank you again for being here. We have restrooms that way. There's water fountains if you need anything to drink. There's also water and coffee there if anyone needs an extra snack as we're hearing things tonight. And though I've not been here for 15 years, I think tomorrow's my 6-month anniversary here at Plymouth. Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to continuing that partnership for many years to come. Part of Plymouth's identity and our core values very much align with the work of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace and Israel Against House Demolitions. We're an open and affirming church welcoming LGBTQ persons. We're a church that supports environmental stewardship for the next 7 generations, protecting our planet, and 2 of those core values very much relate to this work, which is just peace, seeking those things that promote peace and justice in our world, and global mission, partnering locally and globally for those values of peace, justice, and compassion. And so I look forward to hearing about the work of solidarity that Israel Against House Demolitions do, as well as what Mr. Halper has to say this evening. So thank you all for being here, and I hope you find this to be invigorating, stimulating, and energizing event.
And just to supplement what Timothy had to say, he knows wherever he speaks because he, in 2007, met with representatives of the Israel Committee Against House Demolitions on his trip to Israel and Palestine. And so we're really grateful, Timothy, for your warm welcome. Thank you. So you know how it works. I spent an hour or so today working on this wonderful flyer for our upcoming programs, and it's sitting on my desk at home. So I'm gonna mention this to you, and maybe you can make a mental note or at least check our website, etc. We really have a very strong winter and spring coming up. So I hope that if you're not on our mailing list or email list, you can check with me or Joan or one of the other board members. February 21st, Thursday evening, February 21st, we have one of the most prominent American Jewish voices of conscience, author, commentator, filmmaker, Max Blumenthal from Washington, D.C., who'll be here. I was just in touch with Max today. We were texting back and forth, and I was on the phone with him setting up his flight, so that's all taken care of. And he'll be talking about the perpetual war on Palestinians by the Israeli government and also by the U.S. government. He's known especially for one of his latest books, Goliath, Fear and Loathing in Greater Israel. And his most recent work was a film he did that just came out in 2017 called Killing Gaza. So watch your emails from me, as well as our Facebook page, as well as our website for Max coming on February 21st. It's a Thursday evening here in this room at Plymouth Church. And then we're really excited because of a generous grant from National Endowment of the Arts and Arts United and the Indiana Arts Commission, as well as the generosity of a number of you. On Saturday evening, March the 9th, in the sanctuary, we're welcoming a Sufi, I need to move this away from my mouth a little bit more.
Yeah, sorry.
A Sufi ensemble, a Sufi chorus, as well as dervishes who have an evening, and we're calling it Dance of Unity, Dance of Peace. And they're going to perform for us. It's really not a performance, but it's the devotion of the Sema dance, you know, the turning of the dervishes. And so we're really excited to be welcoming them. We had a Jarahi, the Jarahi order coming, and the Sheikh got very ill, and so they're not able to come, but we had a choice between a Syrian group and another group, and I asked for the other group. It's an order of women dervishes. And so you don't find that around the world. You find that in this country, and it's even rare in this country. But you know, we're not only Indiana Center for Middle East Peace, but we're also Plymouth Church, and we do that kind of stuff here. And so anyway, Saturday, March the 9th, tickets are $20. So be looking for that as well. We're really excited about that. It's been a dream of mine ever since we moved to Fort Wayne to host the dervishes here. And I spent a lot of time in Istanbul and are friends with one of the orders of dervishes up in the hills next to the Suleymaniye Mosque. And so we're excited to be hosting the dervishes here. That's March the 9th. I want to say thanks to our partners, Indiana Center for Middle East Peace partners tonight. Victoria Gibson, where are you, Victoria? Thank you. And Jim and Julia Nixon for being partners for our event tonight. So thanks to both of you. I think that's it. We have sweets and treats, thanks to Joan Coslow and other members of our board, Barb O'Connor. Yeah, Ani, what do you need me to say? Oh, and Judy and Frank, right, my gosh, Judy and Frank, where are you? Thank you for being partners tonight. I appreciate it. Jeff Halper. He's been really, I met Jeff back in 2004 in the courtyard of the St. George's Anglican Cathedral in East Jerusalem. And he's really been my teacher ever since. I mean, you know, none of us know about these things on our own. We always stand on the shoulders of giants, and Jeff really is one of those people. He's really been my teacher and my mentor, and I want to acknowledge that publicly, and I appreciate that very much. 2006 Nobel Peace Prize nominee, nominated by the Quakers, arrested in the flotilla. How many times have you been arrested? Who's counting? Arrested as part of the flotilla that was trying to break the blockade on Gaza. Founder of the Israel Against House Demolitions, seeing the demolition of houses as kind of the encapsulating the entire matrix of control that the Israelis have in Palestine and Israel. And what he's going to talk about tonight, really, he's one of the leaders of the joint Palestinian-Israeli One Democratic State campaign. So we're really delighted, Jeff, to have you here and to welcome you to Fort Wayne and to welcome you to Plymouth Church on behalf of Indiana Center for Middle East Peace.
So thanks to Mike, thanks to the church, everybody that put out the effort to get me here. put out the effort to come out tonight. You guys are the hardcore, I think, with this weather. Yeah, I'm Jeff Halper from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which is an Israeli peace and political group. We're a political group that fights the Israeli occupation, but we've always been political in the sense that we want to work for an end to this whole oppression, this whole situation. Not simply protest, not simply resist, not simply comment or critique. And so we've tried to be strategic all the years that we've been working. The problem is, you can't be in a political struggle without an end game. And for many years, the end game, in a sense common between Palestinians and certainly the Israeli left or the Israeli peace camp, was the two-state solution. And in fact, the two-state solution was accepted by the United States, by the international community, by the United Nations, by the Arab League, and that was our project for many years. But over the last certainly 6, 7, 8 years, it's clear, if not before, it's clear that the two-state solution is gone. I'm going to argue tonight that it never was. And so we've been floundering for the last few years. All of us. I think some of the organizations in this country, like the U.S. Campaign and Jewish Voice for Peace, and others have a little bit lost the focus. And I think they're floundering and are trying to find something to do in a way, even to read to it. Because if we're not giving leadership and direction from there, you're not going to liberate Palestine from Fort Wayne. You can go so far, but it's true. You're not the ones that can say what the solution is, where to go. That has to be the stakeholders back home. And so we're trying to do that. We're an organization that we've set up called the One Democratic State Campaign. We're about 50 Palestinians and about maybe 15, 20 Israeli Jews that have sat for the last year and a half to really begin to formulate a political program. I want to talk about it tonight. This is the program, so I'll pass this around. I'm going to just pass it this way. I think this should be enough for everybody.
I'll pass them out for you today, sir.
Maybe couples will take one or something. But I'll talk about this more in depth, but at least you have something to take home. And in the back, you'll see there's a name of about 150 Palestinians and Israelis that have endorsed the program. So I'm not coming just with an idea, but I'm coming with the beginning. We're going to launch in April the beginning of a political movement towards a one-state solution. What I'd like to talk about tonight as well is a strategy of how to get there. So, let's begin the beginning. One question, I don't think this, you don't want to turn down the lights, sir?
Yeah, I want some light on you. That's coming
That's
through.
kind of light.
You want the middle one off? Okay. You'll be in the dark then.
I'll be in the dark. Oh, why? Because of the filming?
Yeah, on the film.
Yeah.
Problem?
Yeah, we're live streaming and I'm filming. So.
But wait a minute. Do it. Can you do it?
Yeah, he'll hit the light. Go ahead.
Do it for a second. Can you get the
Yeah.
slides okay?
It's okay.
Because I'm not.
We're okay. We're okay.
We're okay. It's okay.
You can get this, right?
We got you. We got you.
Okay.
Between my voice and the picture
Yeah,
itself.
we got you.
But one question I start with is why should we care so much about this conflict? I mean, why, when it's below zero, do you guys come out at night to hear about this? There's 1,000, probably more than 1,000 conflicts in the world. Some of them are worse than this conflict from the point of view of the scale of violence. The Congo, jumps out as one of those kinds of conflicts. Almost anywhere you put your finger on the globe, you're going to find a conflict that really should be resolved. Why are we so, in a way, preoccupied with this one? And I think there's some very good reasons. Of course, the oppression of any people is important. So the fact that the Palestinians are an oppressed people by itself demands attention. The fact that Jews are doing the oppressing is kind of a new aspect. The Jews that have had this history of themselves being persecuted. The idea of finally coming together in a country, and that country becoming an apartheid regime that's repressive, certainly is something that's hard to ignore. Israelis, complain of a double standard. But in a sense, we've raised the bar. We've been the ones that have been active in human rights and civil rights for years and years. Jews are very liberal. Jews have sort of set a certain bar for what we as a persecuted people demand of others. So when we turn around and begin to act in oppressive ways, it's kind of appropriate that people call us and say, hey, how can you do that? Of course, this is happening in the Holy Land. So there's certainly a Christian component to this. The fact that we sing about Bethlehem on Christmas and it's a walled-in city, should mean something to Christians. Christians today in the occupied territories are only 1.4% of the population. So you're in a situation where Christians have really, if not been driven off the land, have been induced to leave. And the Christian population was the backbone, the middle class of the Palestinian society. So losing the Christian population really damaged the ability of the Palestinians. The first real nationalists in the Palestinian community were Christians. So, so that's a part of it, I think. So there's a lot of, those kinds of issues that kind of tie the conflict to us as well. But there's something else, I think, that's important. And of course, I had the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, so we're always trying to show exactly what's happening on the ground. So our analysis is grounded. Israel's demolished about 55,000 Palestinian homes, only in the occupied territory. Thousands more inside Israel since 1967. So it's one of the most painful parts of the occupation, and I think that the plight of Palestinians, I think it's unusual also, Palestinians are an oppressed, occupied people in what's really considered a Western democracy. I think that's also part of the reason why the Israeli-Palestinian issue stands out. You have almost routinely oppression in the global south. I mean, we have the Syrian war, you have Myanmar, you have the Congo, you've got what's happening in Latin America in many places. But this is a situation, it's a Western democracy, Israel, or it presents itself as a Western democracy, a part of the OECD, the club the exclusive club of advanced economies, an ally of the United States, maybe closest ally, we all keep saying, on the southern border of Europe, that's an apartheid regime for at least the last 50 years, but I'll argue, has been pursuing a settler colonial project for the last century. Well, that certainly stands out as well. But there's another whole aspect that I just want to mention, and that is that Palestine is also a global conflict. It isn't simply a spat between two local peoples. If it was that, it wouldn't really demand the attention that we give it. The main reason, I think, why the Palestinian issue is such concern is that it destabilizes, first of all, the Middle East. Israel is a tremendous source of militarization and polarization in the Middle East. Israel has become, ironically, You know, we've always talked about the Arab-Israeli conflict. But ironically today, with its military power, Israel, I would argue, has become the hegemon of the Sunni Arab world. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and the states around, not so much Syria and Iraq right now, Iraq a little bit, almost look to Israel as their leader in terms of the fight against the Shiites, Iran and their allies. Israel's very involved with the United States in the Saudi attacks in Yemen. Israel's very involved in Saudi Arabia itself. There's a whole love affair going on. The Saudis can't dream of dealing with the Iranians without Israel. Egypt can't. I don't think Sisi could stay in power without in different ways, policing ways, Israel supports his regime. Even Sudan, that has an extreme Muslim government, is making feelers towards Israel. So that Israel has inserted itself on the Sunni side in this kind of Muslim civil war, with all the destabilization and manipulations going on. As a matter of fact, there's an Israeli company that's being sued by Khashoggi's family, the journalist who was killed in Istanbul, and he was caught through eavesdropping equipment supplied to the Saudi government by an Israeli security firm. So that's, of course, one issue. You're not going to, and John Kerry used to say this all the time, you'll never, it's not the only issue, I'm not saying that, but you're never going to stabilize the entire Middle East and deal with the conflicts and get it on the road to development and stability without resolving the Israel-Palestine issue. It's that constant irritation and source of polarization and violence that it would disrupt any attempt to try to stabilize this entire region, which is a pretty important region in the world. But there's even something more global than that. And that is, I wrote a book called War Against the People. That was my last book. And, the question that always nagged at my mind, when I'm on the ground in front of a bulldozer, trying to defend a Palestinian home, the question that was always nagging me was, how does Israel get away with this? Like we're saying, a European country on the southern border of Europe, in absolute violation of every human rights covenant, international law, defying dozens of UN resolutions, and yet its international status improves all the time. For Israel to be accepted to the OECD, which is the 25, now might be 26, most advanced economies in the world, it has to be voted in unanimously. So one country that would take Israelis' human rights violations seriously enough to say, wait a minute, should they really be joining our club? Because one of the elements of joining the OECD is that you have to conform to human rights and international law. Norway, Ireland, any of the countries, the 25 countries in the OECD could have vetoed that, and yet it got approved unanimously. So how, and not to mention, of course, the American support through different administrations. And on this issue, over the years, the Democrats have been worse than the Republicans on this issue. So how does that what's going on here? Why, how can you explain that? And certainly Jewish, Israeli exceptionality is a part of it. There's a certain racial, I think, undertone. Israelis are seen as European, and Arabs aren't exactly the kinds of people that we see as allies and friends, and all of that. But there's something else going on that I just want to point out before we move on. And that is, you know, if you look at Israel, it's a little country occupying a smaller space. In other words, Israel's a country about the size of Connecticut, occupying a Palestinian territory about the size of Rhode Island. That's kind of the scale of things. So it would seem a small country. But when you look up, I said, okay, I'm looking at the occupation, what Israel's doing to the Palestinians, but that can't explain the support that Israel gets. There's got to be something bigger, a big reason. It's not just sympathy with Israel or the Jewish lobby, you know, because Israel gets support from many countries that don't have Jews. It's not only Christian fundamentalists or evangelicals, because Israel gets support from a lot of countries that don't have Christian fundamentalists. Something else is going on here. And I said, well, what if I looked up at Israel's place in the world? What would I see? And here's a map of what you see. What you see is in Israel, small, but is the sixth largest arms exporter in the world. And by arms, I mean not only weapons, I mean technologies of repression, tactics of population control, surveillance systems, security systems, policing tactics, weaponry for police, the whole range of what I call technologies of repression. And Israel has relations with almost every country in the world. I call this security politics. So what Israel does, and it's very interesting, you know, because there are countries that don't have diplomatic relations with Israel, that nevertheless have close security relationships. So that you create a kind of a quid pro quo. And I sort of describe this in my book. You could go country by country and explain how Israel uses its technologies and weaponry and tactics to support the government in control, or the elites in control, or sometimes the militias, like drug cartels even, that are being challenged by the people from below. In other words, Israel really works with hegemons and elites and governments and dictatorships to keep control. And I can go country by country. I won't go into that now. But there's even a higher level of globalization, what I call globalizing Palestine. Israel's exporting of the occupation. And that is that we all live, all of us in the world, under one capitalist system. One neoliberal capitalist system for the last 50 years. Now, under neoliberalism, capitalism has become extremely predatory, as many of us know. 80% of human beings live on less than $10 a day. About 3.5 billion people live on less than $5 a day. So you've got that whole global south aspect, but the global south is moving into the global north. Your children do not have the prospect of attaining your standard of living in their lifetimes. You know, more and more, you see it in the Occupy movement and so on, more and more middle class young people from the global north are being excluded by this system. So the system's becoming more exclusionary, and it's more rapacious. Wars today are no longer wars between countries and ideologies with battlefields and tanks and navies and so on. They're what are called resource wars. If you look at where wars are being fought today, and Venezuela is just the last example, the latest example, they're fought in places where corporations and the elites, through governments, are trying to get resources. And it affects climate change. It's really destroying the entire planet, this kind of unregulated capitalism. Now, as more and more people become marginalized, as they lose their resources, they begin to resist. People do not become marginalized and impoverished voluntarily. And resistance can take all kinds of forms, from, you know, this rule, don't buy a car made on Monday, you know, to different kinds of sabotage, to protest movements like the Occupy movement, and to, which Max Blumenthal, by the way, writes about. Max, when he comes, he'll probably talk about it, describes how the Occupy camps in Oakland and New York and other places were dismantled by the police according to Israeli police tactics. He had a whole article about that, but I'm sure he'll talk about it. So that as more and more people are excluded, the whole system becomes more violent and more repressive. And where capitalism is going, where the corporations and the elites and the governments are going, is towards what I call global pacification. They have to repress not only people in the countries whose resources are being taken, you know, which we call insurgents, in terms of counterinsurgency, which is really the new form of war against the people today, but also at home. So your police forces, as you know, are being militarized. I mean, your local police force here, I'm sure, has been trained by Israel in one way or another. And the Jewish Voice for Peace has a program called Deadly Exchange, where they're trying to document how Israel is weaponizing and training American police forces. You know, but your police department probably has tanks. I mean, your police department has military uniforms and weaponry. You know, 30, 40 years ago, there were 4 cities that had SWAT teams. You know, these kind of, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger type police with these heavy weapons and so on, the militarized police. Today, almost 90% of American police forces, including the police force in southeast Indiana and northwest Idaho, have SWAT teams. So the whole system here is being militarized. So as capitalism becomes more repressive and is more resistance, it has to become more violent, and it has to engage in what I call war against the people. It's not wars today against armies again, not wars in that sense. Think of the language that's used. Asymmetrical wars, counterinsurgency, low-intensity conflicts, the counterterrorism, and I could go on and on. There's about 40 terms that I found that describe this kind of warfare. So that, okay, the problem is that the United States is not equipped for this kind of a war. You have a Pentagon with $1 trillion a year budget that produces weapons that are completely irrelevant for wars against the people. The Pentagon is producing weapons that are designed for conventional interstate warfare. You're preparing for war against the Soviet Union, basically. So you produce $1 trillion F-35 stealth bomber. It's useless in urban warfare in Afghanistan, or urban warfare in downtown Indianapolis, or against immigrants, or poor people, or global South middle class people who are discontent. You know, and you haven't had many wars against the people in that sense. You know, Vietnam didn't work out well. Afghanistan, Iraq haven't worked out too well. And Europe as well, with its tremendous military industry, hasn't really fought colonial wars for the last 60, 70, 80 years. So that you've got this need of a capitalist system in almost every government to repress its population, to fight wars against the people, not wars of states against states, without the right tactics and technologies and weaponry. And that's the niche, not exclusively, but that's the niche that Israel fills. Israel becomes the go-to country for that. Because Israel's been fighting a war against the people, the Palestinian people, for the last century. You know, you can ask the question, why didn't Israel in 1988, 30 years ago, accept the two-state solution when it was offered by Arafat, and the United States even tried to broker it? Israel could have had 30 years ago, before Oslo, it could have had 78% of the country, and recognition by the Palestinians, by the Arab world, by the entire international community. It could have been 30 years into an era of peace and security. And can you imagine how that might have impacted on the wider Middle East if this whole conflict had been resolved 30 years ago? Why didn't Israel grab that opportunity? Whoa, we're a minority population. You know, the Palestinians are the majority population between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And yet Israel gets 78% of the country. Why wouldn't they grab that? And the reason has to do with security, not really with security, with economics and with power. And that is that you have to look at the occupied territory as a laboratory, as a resource. That's a place where, you know, not many countries, and I'm saying this harshly, but it's true, I document it. Not many countries have a laboratory of millions of people that they can do anything they want to them. You know, Israel demolished 55,000 Palestinian homes. There's 600 checkpoints that millions of people pass through every day to school, to work, to shop, all manned by Israeli commercial, besides the army, commercial security firms. No wonder Israel secures your airports. No wonder it's the world's leader in biometrics and surveillance systems. It's got millions of people as guinea pigs. Gaza, you know, you can't explain the repeated attacks on Gaza, which is like Normandy, using an entire arsenal of the most advanced weaponry in the world, military weaponry, against a little tiny place with no army, and that doesn't really present a threat to you. The disproportionality between the Israeli attacks on Gaza and the actual threat is tremendous. The only way you can explain that is that Gaza is a testing ground for the development and perfection of weapons. And I have in my book a whole list of weapons that are used for the first time in Gaza. And, you know, and people ask me, how did you write this book about the Israeli military? Must be a lot of secret stuff. How do you get access to it? It's not secret. Some of it I'm sure is secret. But why would you develop a great weapon system or a great technology of control that you want to market and keep it secret? So there's dozens of websites of all these companies, including commercial companies, that develop this stuff. And on a lot of the websites, and just you can look them up, they have combat-proven, tested in Gaza, you know, tested, field-tested in the occupied territory. This is what gives you the edge in the market. Why should you buy our surveillance system and not an American surveillance system? Because we've perfected ours on millions of Palestinians, not in some laboratory in Texas. You see? So that the Israeli exports all over the world begin to explain the quid pro quo, how Israel has the clout it has, and globally, because again, in this whole global system, Israel becomes the enforcer of capitalist hegemony, and also the hegemony of elites in each different country. And you can't understand the world unless you get this. You know, if you take today the military and homeland security and policing, which is today one package. If you take the military, homeland security, and policing around the world, it's a $2.5 trillion a year industry. That's going to have a tremendous impact socially on countries, economically on countries. But can you imagine the economic interests involved in a $2.5 trillion? So I wrote a book. I'll be honest. I wrote a book about something I know nothing about. I couldn't tell you a tank from a grenade when I wrote the book. But I'm saying to myself, I'm an activist. I want to make the world a better place. I understand the role of economy and power and violence. And I don't know anything about a $2.5 trillion a year industry. It's kind of a big blind spot. But once you plug that in, the whole world looks different by this kind of a map. You know, we look at the world, you know, in a common sense way. You know, we have our friends, we have our enemies, all of whom change day to day, and we've got allies and so on. But if you look at what I call security politics, you insert the militaries and technologies of repression, a whole different map emerges. For example, the closest ally of the United States is Israel. We love Israel. Israel, you know, we share values. The Prime Minister of Israel every 2 weeks speaks before Congress. You know, we're tied with, well, it's true. There's a lot of relations between Israel and the U.S. Israel has privileged access to Pentagon technologies. That's one of the things that gives it an edge in the world. Because Israel has access to American military technology that even European countries don't have. But, what do you find out? Israel turns out to be the second largest arms supplier to China. Whoa. China is the arch rival of the United States. You know, Trump is you know, the whole American Sixth Fleet is being moved into the South Pacific to contain China. John Bolton, our John Bolton, was in Israel last week. And he said, it was in the papers, so you can understand that Trump's not going to read it. Bolton said publicly, if Trump finds out about the close Israeli-Chinese relations, he's going to really be mad. But that's what, you know, so Israel is the #2 arms supplier to China, to India, after Russia, 2 or 3 sometimes. You know, it's supplying Brazil, it supplies, I mean, you go around the world and you find the Israeli arms supply. So that begins to explain how Israel gets away with it. China might criticize Israel in the UN. That's okay. China will never sanction Israel. It'll never put teeth into its criticism. Or India. Israel's having a love affair with India, with its violent Hindu government. You know, I don't know if you saw, I got a Facebook thing today, that the leader of the Hindu party, one of the leaders of the Hindu party in India, as a matter of fact, a string of leaders of the Hindu Nationalist Party went to, they made a kind of a statue of Gandhi. This is the anniversary of his assassination, and they shot him again because Gandhi was you know, allowed Pakistan to be established and is not seen as a popular figure by the Hindus. So that Israel has relations with that kind of a government, with the fascist Bolsonaro that just was elected in Brazil. Netanyahu is the star of Brazil. With the Eastern European countries, and where Russia is trying to get Eastern European countries to be a wedge in Europe and really to destroy the EU, Israel is right there with it. So, in other words, Israel plays a global role in terms of advancing its own interests, but as well as the interests of a lot of countries that on the surface wouldn't seem to be pro-Israel. The best example being Saudi Arabia. I mean, who would guess Saudi Arabia with its crazy Wahhabi, I mean, that's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda and ISIS come out of Saudi Arabia. With that, I mean, who would expect them to be in bed with the Zionist Israel? But you put arms and security and technology repression into the equation, and all of a sudden you find bedfellows that you wouldn't have expected. So this, I'm not going to get into all of this, but this is a part of the capitalist reality we live in. So to the degree that you can begin to document, I'm not saying by any means Israel's the only player here. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not that Israel's running the world. But I think what I tried to do was to show how a small country like Israel, with the talents it has, especially high tech, and with its ability to carry on a war against the people, is able to play this role globally. So it opens up an awareness of what's going on globally. And one more sentence on that. So Israel is also exporting, because the implications for you are important. Israel's also exporting, beyond all the weapons and technologies, a concept of a security state. And the United States is buying, and Europe, saying that, okay, you can have a democracy, but it has to be subordinate to security. And so security becomes the way in which you organize your society, which threatens your civil liberties. So, for example, Israel is saying, you should do ethnic racial profiling in your airports. You have technology. Why are you spending time with the 80-year-old person in the wheelchair and the 6-year-old kid when you know they're not the problem? You know that. You know you can target and profile who the problematic, and we know who they would profile as well. That's the way you do it, you know, and that's the way Israel does it. Now that's against the law in the U.S., and it should be against the law in the U.S. But once you get security to be foremost in people's minds, and you induce fear, then, you know, it becomes very easy to slip into a security state. So, for example, you know, the airline companies in Europe have been trying for years. You know, if you go to Europe, you don't take off your belt when you're going through airport security. You don't take off your shoes. They're trying for years to get this thing about taking your computer out of the case eliminated. There's no reason in the 21st century that you've got to take your computer out of the bag. But the Americans will not certify your airport unless you do certain things that they want that have nothing to do with security. So it all becomes a kind of a process of keeping people in constant fear. So we begin to self-pacify. You know, we go to the airport and voluntarily take off our shoes. They don't have to tell us anymore. We take off our belts, we take off our computers, we go through these crazy machines. We do that because we want security. So once you instill that in people, then it's a slippery slope towards a security state. And that's really what Israel is trying to sell. Israel is saying, you shouldn't be criticizing us, you should be imitating us. Because you've got all these fears. Look what we've done in Israel. Our people have a vibrant democracy. We're the only democracy in the Middle East, right? We have a flourishing economy. We're the OECD. Our people live with personal security in a country where half the population are terrorists. Whoa. If we can do that, imagine what we can do for you. So the temptation to move in this neoliberal capitalist world of repression towards a repressive security state is very strong. What I'm trying to say in a word is that, there are more than a word, true, is that as your militaries and police forces and security forces Israelize in their tactics and in their weaponry and so on, you're being Palestinianized. Because, you know, in Gaza, the Gazans are only the guinea pigs. The whole idea is to export that weaponry and technology here and other places. So you're on the receiving end of the technologies developed in Gaza, not the Palestinians. The Palestinians are on the way, but you're the market. And so that, you know, I'm dwelling on this because this is, I think, a compelling reason why we have to be concerned with what's happening in Israel and Palestine, because it's a microcosm of what's happening globally, and it's affecting the lives of all of us in ways that we're not very aware. Okay, I made the point. Go home. All right, so let's go back to Israel-Palestine itself. And what I want to suggest is, and we'll come back, we'll tie the ends together in the end. What I want to suggest is we're looking at this whole thing wrong. And therefore, all the solutions that we're trying to come up with are wrong. And we need a new approach, which is what we're trying to advance. We talk about the Israel-Palestine conflict. There is no conflict. It's the wrong word. A conflict is two sides. It's two parties that have a conflict about something, right? And the way you resolve the conflict, you get the sides together, they negotiate, they find some compromises, and they make peace, and it's resolved. There aren't two sides here. From the Israeli Zionist point of view, this is our country. This is the land of Israel from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. And Zionism is, and this is a term, we don't use it often, but it's an important term, is a settler colonial movement. Like, actually, the United States, which is a settler colonial country. It hasn't resolved its colonial relations with the indigenous population. But here, the indigenous population has been so marginalized and even eliminated that they're not really a challenge. So you don't really feel them. In Israel, you know, the Palestinians, as the indigenous population, have much more clout. You know, Israel isn't able to subdue them or defeat them or marginalize them, even though it's trying to do that. So, you know, just like when, you know, the settlers came to this country, you know, when you had, you know, the Indian Wars, Andrew Jackson and everybody, it wasn't a conflict. It wasn't like, you know, the whites and the Indians were in conflict with each other. It was a unilateral process. A unilateral process whereby one people, you know, settlers are not immigrants. Settlers come to a country in order to take it over. That's the idea. So there's no side. When the Pilgrims came here, they didn't want to integrate with the Native Americans and get to know them and so on. Yeah, Thanksgiving and then the massacre. You know, and it's the same thing here. Zionism was a self-contained movement. It was a Jewish movement to go take the land of Israel. It wasn't Palestine. There were no Palestinians. I mean, they were Arabs. You know, you knew they were Arabs, but they didn't add up to a people with collective rights. They were a bunch of Arabs in an area, and you could move them around, back and forth if you wanted to. They had no rights. They had no national collective existence. And the land, you know that famous Zionist slogan, it's a land without a people for a people without a land. So this land without a people was ours for the taking. And every settler colonial movement makes up a story, a narrative, of why they're entitled to take over the land. You know, it usually has to do with God. You know, in South Africa, it was a Dutch Reformed church that said God gave South Africa to the white man. In the United States, it was manifest destiny. God gave his grace on thee, and this belonged to Americans. John Wayne used to say it belongs to the white man because the Indians never developed it. That was his his line. In the French colonies, it was to bring civilization to the savages. And every settler colonial movement makes up a reason why they have a right to take the country. And here, they did that as well. One of the major element of this is the idea of return. That the Jews were, as if the Jews then are the Jews today, the Jews were there, they had a revolt against Rome, Rome won, and exiled them. We were in exile for 2,000 years, and now we're coming home. That's the story. It's made up. There was never an exile. There is no reputable historian, including Israeli historians, that talk about exile. I mean, there was an exile in 536 BC to Babylonia. I won't get into all this, but all this stuff that seems arcane really becomes relevant, because it has to do with the narrative that the settlers make up. In 536, I think it was BC, I was young in those days, so we're talking about 2,500 years ago. The Babylonians exiled the Judeans to Babylonia. And 50 years later, in 580 BC, Cyrus the Great, the Persian emperor, conquered Babylonia and said to the Jews, you can go home. And the Jews said, it's kind of nice here in Babylonia. It was sort of the New York of its day. So a few stragglers went back with the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah, but just a few. Since that time, from the 580s BC until today, the vast majority of Jews have lived abroad voluntarily. They said that, they're not in exile. And there was no exile from the Romans. There's a very interesting book by an Israeli historian named Shlomo Sand like in the beach, called The Invention of the Jewish People. And he gets into this whole kind of a narrative. But that was the idea of it, that we're coming home, we're coming back. Even though it was a made-up narrative. You still hear it, that's still the Israeli narrative. We're coming back to our land, and it's our land exclusively. There is no other claimant to the land, and therefore the process of taking the land is unilateral. You start here, and you move eastward. So what happened in 1967 wasn't that this isn't an occupied territory. The international community sees it as occupied. Palestinians might see it as occupied. But from a Zionist Israeli point of view, which I've been trying to argue until now is the one that really matters, because that's where the power is, there's no occupation. Israel has always rejected the idea of occupation. How do you occupy your own country? So from Israel's point of view, this is Judea and Samaria. And it's not only, those of you with a biblical perspective, it's not only, you see, the whole idea of occupation is that somehow this is external to Israel. Here's Israel, and these are external territories that can be detached, that don't belong, that can become another state. That's not the way Israel looks at it. This isn't the detachable, this is the heart of the land of Israel. This is Judea and Samaria. This is where the biblical events happened, not in Tel Aviv. So in a sense, this was simply the last stage of a process that we call Judaization. That's the important term. If I would put the whole Zionist movement into one word, it would be Judaization. And this is an official Israeli word. It's used by the government. We are Judaizing Jerusalem. We're Judaizing the Galilee. We're Judaizing, and it's a good thing. You see, in this country, in a democracy, it would be racist to say we want to whiteify Fort Wayne, even though some people might think that, I'm sure. Still, giving a privilege to one group over others is racist. In a country like Israel, that's what we call an ethnocracy, not a democracy. And ethnocracies come from Eastern Europe, where Zionism came from. Russia, Poland, Romania. There, the idea is a country belongs not to its citizens, but to one particular group. Hungary belongs to Hungarians. So we don't like the Gypsies and the Roma, and we certainly don't want refugees coming in from Syria. But we want to keep a pure Hungary. The Soviet Union was an empire, and rather than Ukrainians becoming a part of the Russian citizenry, there was a Russification process. That's where you get the conflict today. Russia moved Russians to Russify the Ukraine because the Soviet Union and Russia today belongs to Russians. Poland belongs, that's an ethnocracy. And that's what Zionism is. Zionism came out of Eastern Europe. So the idea here is this is the land of Israel. It belongs exclusively to us, and we're in the process of Judaizing it. And that's a good thing. To get Arabs out and to make Jerusalem a Jewish city is a good thing. It's not racist. So the whole logic is a different kind of a logic in a settler colonial situation. So that basically then we're simply incorporating Judea and Samaria, which is the heart of the land of Israel, into the rest of Israel, which means there was never a two-state solution, even entertained by the Israeli leaders. And in Oslo, in fact, Israel never committed itself to a two-state solution. It never has. In Oslo, for the negotiations to begin, Israel demanded of Arafat that he write a letter not only recognizing Israel, but legitimizing Israel. Israel without borders. The state of Israel, but not specifying borders. Where in return, all Israel did was to recognize the PLO as a negotiating partner, with no goal to the negotiations. And every time Arafat would say we're negotiating a two-state solution, Rabin would say, no, we're not. We're negotiating. You know, and maybe a two-state solution will emerge, but we're not committed to that. So what I'm saying then is not only is it and today I would argue that Israel has laid a matrix of control over the occupied territory. I mean, if anybody can tell me how a Palestinian state can emerge from this, you should win the Nobel Peace Prize. Israel has fragmented in other words, it was never in the cards. But just to be sure that there'll never be international pressures to force Israel back, we've created massive facts on the ground that have completely eliminated the possibility of the West Bank ever being detached or becoming a Palestinian state. It's like a double layer of security. So the Palestinians, 95% of the Palestinians live in these brown areas, the darker brown being Area A, around the very dark brown of the major Palestinian cities. So the darker area is A, the lighter area is B. Now, areas A and B and Gaza, which is a cage, are 40% of the occupied territory. So think of it this way. Think of Rhode Island, which you probably fit in a little corner of Indiana. Rhode Island. Now, the Palestinians are in an area the size of Rhode Island, but on 40% of Rhode Island. Then take that 40% and shatter it into 164 little islands. And that's the reality. And then put 5 million people, almost 6 million people, into those little islands. And that's kind of the reality that you have here. Nothing viable. The Palestinians are confined to cells. They're in a giant prison, basically. And the rest of the land, more than 60%, the grayish areas, is called Area C, under Israeli control completely. with these blue dots that are settlements, about 200 settlements, almost 800,000 Israelis live in the occupied territory, Palestinian territory, with Jerusalem, which is kind of the symbolic religious cultural center, economic center, being gone completely. Because Palestinian East Jerusalem was annexed to Israel 50 years ago. So that's even gone. And you know, with the settlements now, these red areas are what we call settlement blocks. So Israel is now consolidating the individual settlements into major urban blocks that then lock the Palestinians into these Israel calls cantons. And this is all, you know, with a whole matrix of highways that link it into Israel proper. So I would argue there is no more occupation. We should stop talking about a two-state solution. We should stop talking about a conflict. We should stop talking about occupation. This whole thing of end the occupation is old, and it never was. This is not an occupation. Occupation is defined in international law as a temporary military situation. So after 50 years, the fragmentation, the settling of 800,000 Israelis, the facts on the ground say this is no longer a temporary military situation. This has been Judaized. So now we're in a situation where the entire country has been Judaized. It's over. The settler colonial process is done. You can always build another settlement, but basically it's over. So, how do we resolve this conflict? And the reason, again, I go back to why we have to resolve this, why it's in your interest, because of its global and regional impact. Plus, of course, its impact on the Palestinians. Well, the two-state solution then is a non-starter. It was a non-starter, it's a non-option, it's gone. And I think we should stop talking about it. Because the more you talk about an irrelevant solution, the more you're simply muddying the waters. And not only is it gone, and eliminated by Israel, let's keep this in mind. The Palestinians agreed to a two-state solution. This is the first time in history that a colonized people agreed to give up 78% of their country for peace. That's never happened in the history of colonialism. You imagine you guys giving back California? You know, it doesn't happen. And it happened here. So that generous offer on the part of the Palestinians has never been appreciated. They've been the ones that have been cast as being the intractable ones. The ones that you can't talk to, even though they're the ones that gave up 78% of their country for a two-state solution. And it's Israel that said no. That's important. Tomorrow, Abu Mazen would sign on a two-state solution if he could. So this, we have to hold Israel accountable. And another way that Israel gets away with it is by casting itself as the victim. Which, of course, links up to Jews, who are the ultimate victims. You know, and if you're the victim, that's a very powerful place to be. Because you can have all the power. You can be the 6th largest arms exporter, the 4th largest nuclear power in the world, and you're the victim. You have no responsibility. You can't be held accountable for your actions in international law because you're the victim. So the framing is important, that it's Israel that eliminated the two-state solution. Israel has to be held responsible for that, which means then that not only is a two-state solution gone, but there already is one state. In other words, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, like I said, the settler colonial project of Zionism is over. This is already one functioning country. You can't get into this country from any direction without going through Israeli border controls. There's only one effective government, and it's not the Palestinian Authority. There's only one army. There's only one currency. Whether you're in Hebron or Gaza or Tel Aviv, you use the shekel, controlled by the Bank of Israel. There's only one infrastructure, one water system, one electrical system, one highway system. By any measure, this is already one functioning country, and it's an apartheid country. It's an apartheid regime, just like South Africa. Not based on race, doesn't matter, but based on the two elements that make up apartheid. One is when one population separates itself from the others. That's the apart. Apartheid means separateness. And you just have to look at the Israeli flag. It only represents one group, a minority group in the country, to see that that population has separated itself from the others. And then that population creates a regime of permanent institutionalized domination. It's not Jim Crow. It's not racism or discrimination. It's part of it. I mean, or those things are part of that system. But it's the regime. It's the legal system. It's the way that the country is conceived. It's the political system that privileges one group over another. And you have that. You have one country under one ruling regime, one ruling power, Israel, that has three separate regimes, legal regimes. There's one legal regime for Israeli Jewish citizens, like me, that have the right to come back. Israel is a vibrant democracy if you're Jewish. I have no problem speaking out, traveling. You know, I lived a privileged life there. There's a legal regime for non-Jewish citizens of Israel, especially Palestinians in Israel, that have certainly second-class citizenship. And last month, the parliament passed a law that said that. It's called the Jewish Nationalities Law. That said, you know, non-Jews, they don't say Palestinian, they say non-Jews are second-class citizens in law. And there's a third legal system for the non-Jewish residents, non-citizens of the occupied territories. So you've got three separate legal systems based on basically race, but really based more on ethnicity, religion, you know, Jewish, Palestinian, in the same country. And that's apartheid. So I'm going to assume that apartheid is not acceptable to any of us, regardless of whether you like my arguments or not. So if the two-state solution is gone, and the one apartheid state is unacceptable, it seems to me the only alternative left isn't a way to go with the flow. You say to Israel, okay, you created one state. You did that deliberately, systematically. You knew what you were doing by your settlements and so on. You created one state. We accept that. Fine. But it can't be an apartheid state. So our task is crystal clear: to transform one apartheid state into a single state of democratic rights, equal rights for all its citizens. Which shouldn't be such a shocking thing for Americans. Oh, democracy. You know, why didn't we think about that before? And somehow the idea of this country being transformed into democracy is shocking for people. I mean, I get thrown out of the window. If I went to Congress, they wouldn't even let me in. It's a shocking idea. And it's, you know, and that's interesting. I mean, you're sending your army all over the world to bring freedom and democracy to people, right? They don't especially want them. Here come the Palestinians. Let's say, you know what? We wouldn't mind a little freedom and democracy. We're buying. And the answer is no. You can't have it. Everybody else has to have freedom and democracy, or we'll cram it down your throats, but you Palestinians can't. Because there has to be a Jewish state. And so you have to live under apartheid forever, which is the bottom line. So it seems to me a kind of an equation that we should be able to break if we work from the grassroots. It's a stark choice between apartheid that exists and a democracy. And now you go to your member of Congress and you say, well, you know, it seems to be a no-brainer, although your member of Congress is probably Republican, so maybe it is a brainer. At any rate, that's, I think, the way we have to frame it. That's half the story of it. I'm not going to go on too much longer, but what I want to do, I won't get into settler colonialism, is to say not only is this the idea, but okay, what are we talking about? Because if you go talk to your member of Congress, they want a plan. They don't want a nice idea. They hear nice ideas all the time. They don't want an analysis. They're certainly not going to invite me to sit in their office for an hour giving a lecture on human rights and Zionism. What do you want is what they're going to ask you. And if you don't have an answer, they'll show you the door after you finish your coffee. So our answer, and this is the program that you have, is a detail. I mean, we still have to flesh it out much more. It's the beginning. But a 10-point program. Now, if we're talking about settler colonialism, the solution isn't two sides get together and negotiate technically. The solution is decolonization. Now, what does that mean? So I'll go over four. There's 10 points. I'll go over 4 points briefly, just to give you the meat of what we're suggesting. So the first part is to decolonize. We're talking now about one country, a single country, with a constitution that we don't have today. Israel is the only country in the world, except Britain, that has the Magna Carta, that doesn't have a constitution. And that's why we can pass all these outrageous laws we pass, like the Jewish nationalities law. So rather than an ethnocracy that we have today, in which a country belongs to one particular group, we want to change this to a constitutional democracy in which the country belongs to all its citizens. You don't really have a concept of citizen in Israel today. Certainly not in, most of the people living in that Israeli-controlled state are not citizens. So that's the big change. A democracy with a citizenship. Second, the right of return. Palestinian refugees have an absolute right of return. Them and their descendants, because they're part of the citizenry. A refugee and the descendants of refugees are a part of your civil society. Even if they fled or if they've been driven out, they don't lose their status as being a part of that citizenry. So the minute we move from a country based on religion and ethnicity and nationalism to a country based on citizenship and citizens and a civil society, refugees have the right to return and to be reintegrated into society. This is an absolute for Palestinians. They won't even look at a plan, and rightly so. That doesn't include the right of return. Third, individual rights. I don't have to go into detail. It's like in this country. There's one citizenship, one parliament, one set of elections, and everybody has equal rights. You can live anywhere in the country. You can you have integrated schools. You have complete freedom of movement. In other words, equal rights in every domain of life. Now, this is the hard part. Because we're not talking about Kansas, or for that matter, Indiana. This isn't just a bunch of voters. The rest of the world, including the Middle East, is very different from the U.S. In the U.S., taking aside the Native Americans, who have been very, very marginalized, the American population came together in kind of a neutral way, in a country to create a new country. So the state proceeded, and then you got immigration. So the state proceeded mainly the different ethnic groups. And there were no national groups here except the Native Americans that still have their national rights, and they were seen as nations. That's why they signed treaties with them. But they've been marginalized. In the rest of the world, especially in the Middle East, the national ethnic religious groups preceded the state. States are brand new. I mean, Israel was only 1948. States are new even in Europe. They're only 150, 200 years old. So you have to recognize the existence of the collective groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, national groups that are there, that aren't going to disappear if one state is imposed or develops on them. And therefore, you've got to accept the collective rights of the people that live there. Israeli Jews, Palestinian Arabs, and all the other different ethnic and religious groups in the country that have the right to their own identities and their institutions and their languages and so on. It doesn't give you any privileges, but it's a safety net that says all groups can continue in the country. You can continue to speak Hebrew. Nobody's going to close the Hebrew University. Haaretz newspaper that my son edits, or is the editor of the English language website, can continue to publish. Palestinians have their national culture, even though we're all sharing a common multicultural democracy. That's important also because the Israelis are going to be the minority, the Israeli Jews. And they're not stupid. They ask, the first thing they're going to ask from our plan is, what's going to prevent the Palestinian majority in parliament from doing to us what we do to them? The tyranny of the majority. What's going to prevent them from passing laws that discriminate or that even throw us out? So all this does, the collective rights idea, is to say that Parliament does not have the authority to enact any laws that discriminate against any community under the Constitution. That's it. It's a safety net. Now Jews can relax, and get on with building the state because they're a legitimate part of the community with the Palestinians. The next stage is, all right, but what replaces this then? We've decolonized. We've dismantled the structures of domination. We've created a level playing field for everybody. Okay, equal rights. But how does it work? So, I'm not going to get into the whole program, but this is the piece that I think is most hopeful. And that is, we're constructing a shared civil society. In other words, we're all coming together, and over 2 or 3 or 4 generations, a new civil society will emerge. Simply from the experience of living together in daily life. And I'll give you one example. I mentioned this to some of my friends before today. Just one example of nation building. In a society in which everybody can live together, go to school together, intermarry, and so on. And that's the World Cup. Football in the rest of the world isn't the NFL. It's soccer, as you call it. Well, the World Soccer League, the World Football League Association, is called FIFA. And in the world standings in FIFA, the Palestinian national football team has a higher ranking than the Israeli national football team. Now, neither one have been able to get into the World Cup, which is a huge thing. So that if we combined our resources, maybe we could get it. Can you imagine the impact if we had one national Palestinian-Israeli team in the World Cup? I mean, that's exactly the kind of daily human nation building that builds a civil society, that builds a country. And that's really what we're thinking of. We have other parts of our program I won't get into, but this is sort of the way we see it, like this. In other words, everybody's living in one democracy, one citizenship, one parliament, and so on. But there's a common civil society that everybody shares. Now, not everybody's going to want to live in one common civil society. You know, you have Jews, especially the ultra-Orthodox, but others that want to stay in their own communities, or Israelis. You have Palestinians that aren't ready to jump into a society with Israelis, especially the refugees coming back. So there'll be a time for a generation or two or three before this civil society starts to take hold. In the beginning, it'll attract young people, it'll attract more secular people, it'll attract middle-class people more, and over time, our hope is that the civil society will expand. In the meantime, you still have your space for your own ethnic, religious kinds of identities. One thing that's very interesting, I'll just mention, and that is that the country isn't only Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews. We have 40,000 African asylum seekers in the country that are liable to stay. Israel is not able to get rid of them because of international laws. Well, that's the nucleus of a major community. You've got 150 to 200,000 Russian citizens of Israel who are not Jewish and don't want to be Jewish. That's another significant community that you don't really hear about. You've got the children of foreign workers. There's 354,000 foreign workers in Israel, most of whom go back, but you know, like everywhere, they leave kids, they marry some of them, you know, with the local population. 25% of the kids in first grade in Tel Aviv are not Israeli. They're what you would call illegal immigrants. So, you know, the country is actually much more diverse than we would assume. So that's the concept. That's, you know, the one state as we conceive of it. I think the beauty of it is that it's a win-win. It's not against anybody. It doesn't want to dismantle anything except domination. It doesn't want to destroy, but it wants to transform. You know, we're not going to destroy settlements. We're going to transform them into integrated communities, and then they stop being settlements. So I think that this program is really, and this was the idea, a genuine program that we can bring forward into the community, into the international arena. Not some left-wing program that me and 5 of my friends like. I could do that with my eyes closed. But a genuine program that really you have to take seriously. And I think we've done that.
Well, I think that's enough for us to chew on for a little bit. Jeff, thank you so much for being here, and thanks for this really exciting proposal. We have time for questions. Yeah, Ron.
I never thought of this. Jeff, what's the name of the country?
We don't have a name.
I have a joke.
Yeah.
You know, what would be the name of the country that's inclusive? You could call it Palestine. If you spelled Stein, S-T-E-I-N.
There you go.
That works. But I think the name of the country will have to emerge. Because unlike South Africa, see, it's even harder than South Africa. Nelson Mandela could say, before the end of apartheid, we're all South Africans. We can't say that. We're not all anything yet. So we've got to create that overarching political and civil identity before a name could actually emerge.
Timothy, and then Dick.
So I did visit the West Bank in 2007 and received a tour about the roads that only Israelis had access
That's
to.
right, the apartheid roads.
Yes, that I assume all the roads that you put on the map
That's
were roads that are exclusively for Israeli citizens. So how have so how has that changed or evolved in the past 12 years in terms of additional infrastructure that in the West Bank that's only accessible to Israeli citizens or settlers?
Right. It's all emerged in that direction. You know, there's been a lot of infrastructural building. Just last week, if you look in Haaretz even, just last week, a lot of these roads are apartheid roads and that only Israelis can drive on. So what Israel's been doing in some places is creating separate little Palestinian roads. In other words, there's 4-lane highways, and then somewhere out there in the hills is a 2-lane, back and forth road. But now what Israel is, it's just opened a road, for example, right in here between Jerusalem and the West Bank. That's one road, because why build 2 roads? It's one road with a wall down the center. So one side of the road leads with Israeli drivers, leads to Israeli communities. The other side with Palestinian drivers goes to certain Palestinian places. So the idea of apartheid is very much reflected in the infrastructure. The settlements are growing. When the Oslo peace process began, there were 200,000 settlers. When it ended 7 years later, there were 400,000 settlers. Today, there's 800,000. And of course, what we call settlements, it's not really the right word, are really cities. 50, 60, 100,000 people or more. So that this is being densely populated by Israelis, and the infrastructure, the Israeli infrastructure, has the dual function of both incorporating Judea and Samaria into the country. So if you live in Ariel, right here in the center, you're 20 minutes from Tel Aviv. So these are really dormitory suburbs. They're that integrated into, you can live in Ariel, work in Tel Aviv, go to a movie in the evening, and go home easily, on a super highway. Whereas the Palestinians are being confined and really not only isolated, but really confined where they can't move. Palestinians don't go anymore, Palestinians, from, let's say, Nablus to Hebron. You end up being confined to your little enclave because it's dangerous and a hassle to move even from one island to another. And so your marriage patterns change, For example, Christians used to marry between Bethlehem and Ramallah. You can't really do that anymore or between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Because if your daughter goes to live in Jerusalem, you won't see her again because you have no permit to go to Jerusalem. So you end up marrying inside these little islands. It's really distorting and changing the entire Palestinian population. So infrastructure and controls and so on have a tremendous impact on the separate, development of both societies.
The so-called matrix of control.
So-called.
Yes, I have a question on your political program, collective rights number
That's
4,
right.
which you showed us on the screen.
Right.
You indicated that the Constitution will deny the Parliament the authority to enact any laws. Does that mean the Constitution cannot be amended?
Well, no, any constitution can be amended. Actually, any constitution could be ignored for that matter.
But you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, I know what you're getting at. Look, we're going into this in good faith. And that's been the problem until now. Israel has not been in good faith. So, they've been so-called negotiating, Oslo, and the roadmap, the Annapolis process, John Kerry, all these things. But, Israel's talking negotiations, but it's never intending. It's not a good faith negotiation because, when I sit across, and it's happened, I sit across from the colonel in the military administration of the West Bank, responsible for house permits, giving Palestinians building permits. So I'm explaining to him, we're having a conversation over coffee, the problems of Palestinians and how it's crowded and it's a human right to have a shelter and they need permits. And he's explaining to me the difficulties of giving permits. It's a very nice professional discussion, but it's not in good faith. Because I know that he's not going to give building permits. I know this is just perfunctory. It's a conversation we're having, but we both know that Palestinians don't get building permits because Israel wants to freeze building in 1967. There's a political agenda. He's not going to say that, and I'm not going to call him on it because that would end the conversation. So we're having this whole conversation that we both know is bullshit. So that's the problem, you see. And so if you go into this kind of a thing, you've got to be specific. That's what we're trying to be as specific as we can about what exactly we're talking about. So when the sides agree or parties agree or it comes about, it's all up front. There's nothing hidden. And it's good faith. Now, if then you want to change something, then it's a transparent process. It's not going to be some hidden process where one group can change the Constitution. So again, you create a transparent, equal kind of a process that can be changed, but hopefully, it shouldn't be changed. Even if, one group is a racist group who wants to change it in a bad direction, it should be transparent enough. And, again, the idea of a win-win solution is that it's good for everybody. In other words, if one side loses, the other side loses as well. Everybody has an interest. I have a Palestinian friend who says, what's good for the Palestinians is good for the Israelis. You see, and I think if you create that kind of a structure, if people see it, there's no motivation to go back and destroy it by changing the Constitution in a way that gives privileges to one group over another. It could happen, but hopefully you structure it in a way that it won't.
We've seen in this country we have a constitution.
Yeah.
Linda, and then John, I saw, then Todd.
I'm a nurse practitioner, so I think about your healthcare system, and I would understand Israel has a pretty good healthcare system, Palestinians not so much. So how do you keep from totally overwhelming this concept with all these Palestinians now suddenly having access to the same kind of healthcare that the people up on the settlement hill? Financially, how can that work?
No, you have to really invest in infrastructure. Palestinians haven't had infrastructure building for 50 or more years, so that's true. But there's a couple things. First of all, the Palestinian economy is a good economy. It's suppressed. It's not functioning, but potentially it's a good economy if the constraints are off. It's a very highly educated population. They have a high-tech industry, they've got tourism, they have other industries, so that they and this wider government could fund that kind of, look at their funding settlements. They funded infrastructure for 800,000 settlers, they could fund infrastructure for the rest. The other thing that people don't take into account, unlike South Africa, is that the Palestinians have a very rich and a very educated diaspora that would kick in very much, about the same size as the Jewish diaspora, and I think no less wealthy, located largely in Latin America, but in other parts of the world as well, that have resources. So I think they would kick in. I think within a fairly short period of time, you would get to an economic parity and building and so on that would really surprise everyone.
John? And we need brief answers to brief questions.
Why so much? Do we have to be out or what? Okay. We'll be here in an hour.
Well,
We love you, Jeff.
I know, but I came all the way from Israel. So used me for more than an hour.
If I could ask a short question, and I can finish it. My cosmological friends told me that there are many quantum parallel universes within our universe. And so when you talk about the Israelis negotiating in good faith creation of a state where non-Jews have equal rights with them, I wonder, what universe are you living in?
In what sense? What do you mean by that?
I can't imagine a universe in which they would do that. Can you? Isn't that self-delusion?
In which Israelis are ruling with Palestinians?
In which the Israelis would negotiate a situation like that.
Okay. Well.
In good faith.
Isn't this just pie in the sky?
Yeah. Well, I didn't get into this because Michael was We're looking at hovering, so I cut short what I was going to say. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, that I'll say briefly, I promise, it has to do with strategy. How do we get there? How do we do this? I agree with you. This is the missing piece. And here it's very much, I think, like South Africa. The ANC understood in South Africa that the whites were not going to be active partners in dismantling apartheid. Why would they be? They're they're benefiting from it. So what they did is they created an ANC alliance with the international civil society, especially churches. And governments were hostile to them. Reagan was very hostile. He was in favor of apartheid. And the churches, the labor unions, all many of us were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle locally, and we created a situation by forcing our governments to intervene and corporations to withdraw. That's BDS. Part of BDS is divestment, and the anti-apartheid struggle focused on divesting from South Africa. That had a tremendous impact. And finally, we made it unsustainable. The whites gave in because they simply couldn't sustain it anymore. That's what we have to do with Israel. I agree with you that the Israelis are not going to be active partners in this. We're not naive. We're not going to sit down and Israelis are all of a sudden going to say, yeah, we'd love to live with Palestinians. They're like the whites in South Africa. They're not going to be part of that. So we have to create an alliance between Palestinians, and that's why our movement is led by Palestinians, and you guys, the international civil society, and then you begin to affect your governments. But what we're inserting that we're missing today is an end game. In other words, there is the infrastructure ready. BDS is a worldwide campaign. You've got the US campaign, you've got Palestinian solidarity groups all over the world. I just did a tour last year of Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and Tromsø, Norway, all of which have vibrant Palestine solidarity committees. I think Palestine has reached the level of the anti-apartheid struggle. The difference is that South Africa always had an end game. It was one person, one vote. And we knew where we were going, what the end game was. We don't have an end game today because we're in between the two-state solution and something else. This whole worldwide movement is kind of stuck a little bit. We're doing the BDS and this and that, but we're kind of stuck because where are we going? So if we can insert this kind of an end game, now we give direction to you. And then you pick up that gauntlet and you begin to run with it in terms of changing public opinion, going to your government, changing policy. And in that way, we work to make Israeli apartheid unsustainable. And that, I think, so the Israelis have to give in. You have situations, it's ironic that you have to force undemocratically a population to become democratic. But it happens. It happened in South Africa. It happened in Serbia, where the Serb population was not capable of getting into an arrangement with the other peoples. It happens sometimes, and therefore there has to be intervention, especially led by an indigenous population that has a right to overrule a repressive majority population. So I think that would be the answer.
Yeah, question, Jeff. How do you deal with the current military structure in your proposal? Because it seems to me that unless you can figure out how to dismantle or neutralize the current military, the first time there would be a synagogue that got blown up by whoever, there'd be the high risk of a military junta and military dictatorship taking over. What's the alternative for the ongoing security then of everyone who lives in whatever the new country is called? Because obviously there's the real and even perceived perception that there's risk from Iran and other countries and so forth. How do you deal with that?
You know, de Klerk wrote an article in the Haaretz newspaper a couple of years ago in which he said you can't do things in a slow stage kind of a way like this. He said the way it worked in South Africa was we did it immediately. Otherwise, and they were ready because they had a constitution already before the end of apartheid. So if we do things more quickly, the point is you integrate the military. You integrate, just like they did in South Africa. Israel had the same thing. Israel in 1948 almost had a civil war because Begin and his right-wing groups wanted a separate army. They didn't want to integrate with the left-wing Israeli army. You had the Altalena, which was a ship of arms brought in by Begin to fight the Israeli army. Got the Israeli army sunk and killed some of the right-wing Israeli fighters. So you have those tensions. But one of the first things you do is to integrate the security forces, the police forces, the military forces, and that's what the Palestinians asked. That's the first question they asked after a presentation like this. This was the third. The first one, if you were Palestinians, the first one would be who controls the army. And if, you say, like some would say, well, Israel has to for a while, just to be sure, they walk off, go get coffee somewhere, the Palestinians. So you have to integrate, the military services. And, in some ways you have that today. I mean, Israel, if the only thing working in this whole Oslo process is the close cooperation between the Israeli army and the Palestinian security services. They work hand in glove. And in negotiations, you'll see in hotel lobbies, the Israelis are over here, the Palestinians are over there, and all the security people are huddled together in a corner. They're all brothers and they love each other, so that already you have, I think, a working relationship between those forces. And so I don't think that's a difficult thing. Then if there's bombings, I mean, there could very well be violence, certainly. But those become criminal issues, not so much, they're not military issues. And you have the police deal with that. So I think it's a process that's doable.
Let's say thank you to Jeff for being here. February 21st, Thursday.